Okay, so
Mae-ling.
yes, Prof. Thank you. Okay.
Welcome.
So it's an honor to introduce the last session, Monumental Lives, co-narrated by Levon Bell and Michael Barrett. Their story explores the history of the enslaved in the Nordic region. Using many reference points and layers, we explore how the monument, existing sites, and a broad material ecology can serve as media to activate and hold space for exploring the lives of the enslaved. Levon Bell is a contemporary artist who makes visible the unremembered. Borrowing from elements of architecture, history, and archaeology, Bell creates narratives that challenge the colonial hierarchies and invisibility. She explores the material culture of coloniality, and her work presents visualities and narratives. Working in a variety of disciplines, her practice includes painting, installation, photography, writing, video, and public interventions. Borrowing from elements of architecture, history, and archaeology, Bell creates narratives that we'll see today in the project, I Am Queen Mary. Her work has been exhibited widely in the Caribbean, the USA, and Europe in institutions such as the Museo del Barrio in New York, Casa de las Americas in Cuba, the Museum of the African Diaspora, and Christiansborg Palace in Denmark. Welcome, Bell. Dr. Michael Barrett is a cultural anthropologist, researcher, and curator of African collections at the National Museums of World Culture in Sweden, where he is responsible for critical development of research, exhibitions, outreach, and public programming relating to the cultures and societies of the African continent and the African diaspora. His research includes the history of collections, migration, global fashion, materialities of African religions and art, and subjectivity in colonial archives. Among recent curatorial projects of his are the contemporary art shows Remixing the Future and Sonaxis in 2021, and Africa Ongoing from 2017 to 2021. During his leisure time, he tries to understand his Afro-diasporic family history that extends from Sweden to the Atlantic world, Jamaica, England, United States, and West Africa. Welcome to you both, and I'm passing it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. And I'm very excited also to be in conversation with the other panelists. So I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of background. I live in St. Croix, the United States Virgin Islands. The Virgin Islands was colonized by Denmark for approximately 250 years. And although we've been a part of the United States for a little over 100 years, so much of the material culture that we live in comes from the colonial period where we were Danish. And also that period included the enslaving African people and creating on the island that I live in, on St. Croix, about 150 sugar plantations. What that means is that there's no space for, it's very difficult to move around in this space and not be reminded of some aspect of that history. Whether it be I'm taking my kids to a soccer match, you see sugar mills, whether it is that after it rains, you see remnants like colonial pottery that come up after it rains. You find them in the gutters, you find them outside your yard, you find them outside your house. And in this particular image, this is an example of pottery that came out of the Royal Copenhagen. That's probably at least over 100, maybe 150 years old, that I found outside of my studio. My studio is located in the town of Christiansted, which is a colonial town from starting maybe in the late 1600s. And my studio is a part of the section that's where the first freed of the enslaved were relegated to live by law. And so my structure and where I work also, I've thought about it as a kind of social practice project, the renovation of this this building, which I call the house that freedom built. So I'll start off talking a little bit about how this house has also inspired the trajectory of my work and how it led into the project I Am Queen Mary. When I purchased this building, I didn't know anything about the history. I learned later by a historian who actually offered to do some research on the building. And because I did a lot of the renovation work myself, I started to develop a very intimate relationship to the architecture and the materials and the materiality of the space. And so it started to retrain my eyes. I started to notice details in the rafters, details in the stones, details in the structure. And also, like I mentioned, finding this piece of colonial era pottery outside my studio, I was really fascinated with how it looked like, almost like a miniature painting. In the Virgin Islands, I think, this kind of pottery you can find throughout the Black Atlantic world, but we actually have a nomenclature for it. We call it Cheney, which is a hybrid word. It's mixing China, where the original designers of this kind of porcelain came from, and money. And it's called that because during slavery times, all the way up until from oral history and talking to people, I've heard people talk about people did it all the way up into the 1940s. Children would use them as play money in games. So what they would do is they would round them to look like coins. And I was really interested in this kind of repurposing of colonial trash, and how fascinating it was that people used their imagination to create kind of another form of currency, and the playfulness and the imaginativeness of that. And I was also really interested in thinking through how these small fragments, how there was something missing from the patterns that we couldn't really see. So I started a series of paintings. Maybe we can go to the next slide so you can see a little bit more expansively. I started a series of paintings where I started to piece together collections and images of Cheney. I myself don't have a very large collection. What I do is I photograph other people's collections. There's a huge jewelry making, a cottage industry of jewelry makers here, and it's a popular thing that people, like I have here, people take them and they use them also in jewelry. So a lot of these jewelry spaces have massive collections of them because people bring it to them and sell it to them, et cetera. And so what I find really interesting about this work, these paintings are not pre-designed. I call them process paintings. They're very much me thinking through the process of reconstituting, which I feel is very reflective of the ways that we think through the Constitution or the identity formation of the Caribbean, how we may have parts of our African identity, European, Indigenous, Asian, and we have to kind of piece them together to form something new. So usually the process is I look through lots of different images and I try to kind of piece together the patterns and the fragments. And I think it's also a commentary on the fact that we live in the fragments of this history and kind of how do we navigate that. In the next slide, come full circle, finding a piece of a colonial era piece of something that came from the Royal Copenhagen in 2017. I was able to work actually with the Royal Copenhagen and create a small, what they would call an Unica series. I thought that was very significant for me in terms of, thinking about this extremely renowned, powerful brand of porcelain products, which is known all over the world, and kind of being able to disrupt their narrative a little bit. So as you could see, I don't know if anybody knows much about the way that the Royal Copenhagen is, but they're extremely traditionalist. It's kind of mixing these artists who do these hand-painted designs, but they're mass-produced. And so by me, I was really interested in kind of inserting my subjectivity into this long narrative and trajectory. I had originally proposed to them for the centennial year that happened in 2017 to do a memorial plate. They had long since stopped doing memorial plates, but this was kind of a compromise that I was able to work out with them to work on this series. I introduce this work because it's a very good example of the ways that my practice has thought through the materiality of the colonial period and tried to insert new narratives in them. And that very much leads to the construction of I Am Queen Mary. So in the next slide, this project is a transnational project between Danish artist Jeanette Ehlers and myself, which began as there was actually a Danish professor and researcher named Hella Stenholm, who, as she was thinking about the upcoming 100th centennial anniversary of the sale and transfer of the Virgin Islands from Denmark to the US, she approached the two of us separately in around 2014 to think through the idea of memorial. And also it started first from this idea of wanting to connect these two warehouses. The one on the left is in Denmark and the one on the right is in Christiansted, because these spaces were very much connected through the trade, but they have kind of been disconnected in different ways through colonial amnesia. And so in the next slide, both Jeanette and myself had different ways that we thought about thinking about a monument that come out of our separate practices. So Jeanette, who often works with video and performance work, had thought about a performance art piece that she had done inside that same warehouse, which today houses about 2,500 plaster copies of famous sculptures out from Greek antiquity all the way up to the Renaissance. And she did a performance in which she takes a whip and has ash, black ash, and whips it onto a white canvas. Very much, I think you can interpret it as thinking about, representing kind of the violence that she experiences on her body, being an Afro-Dane, and kind of matching that violence in this gesture. So her interpretation, in the next slide, you'll see that when she thought about thinking about a memorial, it was first based on creating this image, this character that she had created for her performance, and using it as a way to comment and insert another kind of narrative by combining it with the iconic image of Huey P. Newton, one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party. And then later, we had actually talked about, there was a decision to match that with the narrative of Mary Thomas, which there's a historical image of her on the far right. That's the first and only known drawing of her. It's done by an American doctor that visited years after the event that she's most known for, which is the Fire Bon. And that is the largest labor revolt in Danish colonial history that happened in 1878, where several, possibly hundreds of people rose up and burnt down over 50 plantations on the island of St. Croix, burnt down a significant part of the town of Frederiksted in protest to the very slavery-like conditions. So although slavery had been abolished 30 years prior, there was a rush of laws that came in to kind of confine people to plantations and have very similar working and living conditions. And so this rebellion happens in 1878, and she emerges as the most popular leader because she was already a leader in the community. And I think what's interesting in studying archival records is that we, through work that I've done with a group called the Virgin Island Studies Collective, we recently learned in looking at the prison records she's one of actually 4 queens, 4 women that in the African Caribbean tradition, they're named queens for their rebel and leadership role in the community, that we see that she was in her prison record, it actually calls her the one who's named a queen. So in the next slide, you see how I approach thinking about memorialization, again, based on my perspective, living in the Caribbean, living in the remnants of these forced labor camps. Outside my studio, I found these coral stones. And one of the things that I noticed about them was that they had straight cuts, which got me really thinking, like, why are these coral stones here? Why do they have these straight cuts? And the same historian that had helped me learn about the history of my building had pointed me to an archival record from a Danish planter where he describes the process of enslaved Africans going into the low tide, harvesting these coral stones, and then they actually become part of 2 things in most of the buildings in the Virgin Islands during that period. They become a part of the foundation of all the buildings, which then the Danish brick get puts on top that was imported from Flensburg. And then they also are ground and burnt and become the binding of all of the material of the Danish bricks. And so for me, I thought it was really important to give a new narrative to the way that we think about these buildings, the way that we think about the structure, that we often forget that it's the labor, the brilliance, the talent, the craftsmanship, but not just that, it's also their subjectivities. It's about how they thought about the water as they were, in the ocean carving this out, and how are those kind of left as imprints, how all of that is left in imprints in this material. And so my approach to the sculpture was collecting a lot of these stones, which ironically, you only really see them when the Danish bricks are in ruin and the plaster's fallen off. So I collected some from my property here, as well as another, and started a plinth, created a plinth and encased these stones in plexiglass. And this initial piece was called Trading Post. In the next slide, Jeanette and I decided to work together around late 2016 and 17. It began as a series of conversations about our projects in Denmark, because it's a wealthy country and they, for the centennial, put a lot of money towards people who are interested in thinking through these histories. Jeanette was actually able to raise money to make her project a reality. And we decided to work together and actually not just combine our two projects, but combine our two bodies to create the figure of Mary Thomas as a form of registering a reenactment. And so there's multiple reenactments happening. There's individual, there's also joint reenactments. There was 3D body scanning that basically scanned both of our bodies. And I think if we think of our bodies as another kind of archive, like I think about my nose, it's definitely my father's nose. It's probably somebody else's nose, maybe my great-grandfather, my great aunt, and it goes all the way back. And if we can see our bodies as literally registers of our history, it was part of Jeanette and I thinking about how could we, as two artists from different parts of the Atlantic, create a bridge for to be, and a platform for us to be able to discuss this history. And so the way that we really think about this project is thinking about a way to invite others into the history, which is why the titling of the work is very significant. I am Queen Mary, because as each person confronts the work, we're suggesting that we are also situating ourselves in the history, and we're asking others and inviting others to situate themselves. You can also imagine that this form of declaration of presence has been a long-standing tradition in Black resistance movements. If we even think about the sanitation workers in 1968 that held up the placards, I am a man. We see it in Cuba when people think about, small children, they have to say as like a pledge, seremos como el Che, which means we will be like Che Guevara. And that was also important for us to really think about ways that people can situate themselves in this history and think about their connection to it. In the next slide, you'll see a full image of the sculpture as it exists in Copenhagen today. And also here's an image of the inauguration, which happened on March 31st in 2018. So we chose the tail end of the centennial year for various reasons. Some of it actually was, we had originally wanted it to be the day that the fire burns occurred, and we wanted it to occur inside the centennial year. But that wasn't able to happen because the coral stones had to make their journey across the Atlantic to Denmark, and that became delayed from storms and other customs delays and things. And so when we looked forward for another date, we realized that Transfer Day was actually a very significant date, and that we could actually transform the meaning of that date, which in Denmark is not celebrated, but in the Virgin Islands, it is actually a holiday, a very awkward holiday to, I wouldn't say celebrate, but we commemorate being passed from one colonial power to our next. So it's a very awkward holiday to commemorate. But in Denmark, it's not a day that's marked. And so by having our inauguration on that day, it was important for us to extend the conversations that had opened up in the centennial year. As we could tell, there were dozens of institutions in Denmark that year that had exhibitions and all kinds of panels and talks and books, but we could feel that that was quickly closing down as the centennial year was ending. And so our sculpture was a way of creating a permanent marker and creating something that could really penetrate into the Danish consciousness. And we did that by employing using narrative, the website, the press, like that actually was we actually hired a PR company to help us, because in the beginning, this project was a temporary project. It was an artist-driven project, and we only had temporary permission in the beginning. And so it was very important for us to generate attention and generate conversation so that the Danish government would reconsider not only making the monument permanent, but also the status of that warehouse was slated to be sold. Like many of the other buildings on that harbor front, Danish government sold them. They didn't think that they were significant to maintain. And so our sculpture also brought a lot of attention to that building and its history. And it's now being in conversation to becoming a museum that's going to talk about the colonial history. So I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with the other panelists. And thank you. That's the end.
So thank you, Lavon. That was beautiful. Really hard to follow, but I'll do my best. Okay, to Sweden. To establish the presence of Black people in Sweden is really hard work. We who belong to the African diaspora here, in searching for firm ground under our feet, are faced with numerous hurdles. There's a very small body of records. We're looking at a relatively short historical period. Sweden had a comparatively limited direct involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, as well as in plantation slavery. And more importantly, the persistent collective self-image as colorblind humanitarians, which is held by the majority society. This amounts to a powerful pretense, the idea that Sweden has no connection to the Atlantic. But in order to find the enslaved in the Nordics, we are relegated to using fragmented sources. So we ask, what worlds could the enslaved build with the resources they had? What domestic worlds can we uncover from the fragments saved from history? Two life stories. So the first is Kushi. So born around 1750, Kushi was raised in an enslaved family on the sugar plantation La Reine in St. Croix. His mother was called Nartzi and his father Andres. As a boy of 8, he was selected by his enslaver, the Danish governor von Prøck, and put on a ship to Europe. Kushi stayed 2 years in damp Copenhagen with a prominent family before, in 1960, he was presented as a gift to the Royal Swedish Court in Stockholm. The life of Kushi, or Badan, as he's often called, is very well documented and publicized. Many have woven stories around the famous painting by Gustav Lundberg and homed in on Kushi's light and playful image, his role as an exotic jester, an entertainer, and a trickster in 18th century court intrigues. He was not the only person of African descent in 18th century Stockholm. There are records of at least 20 others. Most, if not all, were originally enslaved. But since slavery was not a legal status in Sweden itself, these members of the African diaspora lived in various degrees of servitude, often attached to noble and wealthy households and functioning as so-called Moors, as curiosities and symbols of prosperity and far-reaching influence. But my interest in Kushi here, however, concerns the latter part of his life. When his benefactor, the Queen Dowager, died in 1782, Kushi, then in his 30s, began a concerted effort to break free from servitude from dependence and conditional personhood of his life at court. He did so by choosing to reside outside of the court in various buildings in central Stockholm, by successfully achieving prominent positions and titles in several Masonic lodges, and by assiduously building his impressive library of 1,000 titles, and by attempting to set up a family. More importantly for this discussion, Kushi received from the king a lease for life of 3 crown properties in Uppland, just north of Stockholm. It was Sällna in the parish of Skånela, Löt in the parish of Kårsta, and Gudby in the parish of Norrsunda. The incomes from these small country farms were meant to form the basis of his upkeep. Although Kushi, who had been raised as a noble, was hardly cultivating the land with his own hands, he seems to have identified intensely with this new status. He starts to call himself a farmer, and he spends the summer seasons in the country, away from the congested, busy, foul-smelling central Stockholm. In his diary, there are a few scattered notes from this time. Notes of barrels of wheat, rye, and barley. Strange concoctions to heal ailments, and of course, like any farmer, detailed records of the weather. Around the same time, he marries his first wife, Elisabeth Schwartz. Their life together is comfortable but not wealthy. Their many homes are open to a stream of friends, relatives, and dependents that pass by over the years. I like to imagine them on the day-long journey on horseback from the city through the flat, varied landscape of South Uppland, its woodland, farmland, and lakes. Perhaps they stopped at an inn to quench their thirst in this ancient heartland of Swedish civilization. But tragedy strikes. Elizabeth suffers devastating miscarriages and eventually succumbs in her early 40s to fever caused by stomach parasites. Kushi eventually remarries, but he never has any children. Despite 40 years as a farmer, the landscape left no trace of him. While Kushi was still commuting to his farm in 1810, Evelina Crosby was born among the enslaved in Sweden's Caribbean colony of St. Bart. She was a girl of mixed race, and the story and the possible horrors of her conception remain unheard. We know nothing of her early days on that rocky, unproductive island. Until 1836, on the eve of emancipation in the British colonies, Evelina's life was given as a wedding gift to the Austin family in Demerara, British Guyana. The Austin family were a family of enslavers, of profiteers of enforced labor, and who later were deeply involved in the human trafficking between Asia and the Caribbean. In Demerara, perhaps riding on a wave of empowerment induced by emancipation, Evelina married a local husband and lived an independent life with him for a time. But she soon drifts back to the Austin family, who in the 1840s themselves are drifting back to their motherland, carrying the wealth accumulated on the backs of kidnapped Africans. Now at the summit of the imperial power machine, members of the family moved between Guyana, London, Warwickshire, Honduras, and Hong Kong. Evelina was always there, with her madam or with one daughter or another, carrying, feeding, and caring. Her life took place in the shadows of the Austin's larger-than-life frames. One of the daughters, Mehetabel, had married a prosperous Scottish-Swedish businessman and moved to Sweden. So in 1886, Evelina came to stay with the family of this woman she had raised in their imposing mansion Skeppsta, south of Stockholm. There are some fragments left representing Evelina's last days on this earth, found in the estate inventory made after the death of Mehetabel's husband in 1899. It's a snapshot of Evelina's room in Skeppsta. One iron bed with linen, one birch washstand with a chamber set, carpets, one curtain. All of these are listed as belonging to the deceased master. In addition, one cushion, one polished table, and one bookshelf. And all of these are listed as belonging to the mistress. To Evelina's memory in Gåsinge Cemetery nearby, a granite headstone remains, engraved with these words: Evelina Crosby, born at St. Barthélemy, 1810, died at Skeppsta, 16th of June, 1900, safe in Jesus' arms. And so Kushi and Evelina were stranded, isolated, diluted in a sea of whiteness. But we who came later, we remember their lives, we remember their sacrifice, and we acknowledge these places and these things. Sälna, Löt, and Gudby. An iron bed, a washstand, and a cushion. Thank you. Sorry, I have to, yes, I'm giving over to Marie-Louise Richards. Thank you, Marie-Louise.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you so much, Lavon. I have the pleasure to introduce Janelle Tvum, who is the founder and creative director of Black Archive Sweden. It is a contemporary archive that is based on the experience of Afro-Swedes. She's also a filmmaker, educator, researcher, and cultural producer, who in her work often explores questions about the conditions around visibility and invisibility, memories and historical descriptions from a Black feminist perspective. Recent work includes the documentary short film, Mother's Body from 2020. And next, Janelle will speak a little bit about the initiative Black Archive Sweden. Thank you so much. Welcome, Janelle.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much, Marie-Louise, for the introduction. In this short introduction, I will primarily present the vision of Black Archive Sweden and how our work is connected to it. Black Archive Sweden is a contemporary archive in making, centered primarily on the experiences and narratives of Afro-Swedes and Black people in Sweden, working within the intersections and tensions between archive, art, and research. And the production team currently consists of myself, Joella Kalala, Elsa Mietala, and Ulrika Flink. As it has been touched upon by previous presenters over the day, the archive is a space for narratives about time, a space where the past is chosen and constructed. And this selection of the past means that the archive is by nature marked by gaps and lack. Therefore, in many states and official archives in Sweden, there is limited to zero presence of Black Swedes or Black people in Sweden. What can be found are often fragments, unintentional, decontextualized finds in unexpected places, and materials and people categorized in ways that reproduce racist and exotifying ideas of Blackness. Despite the gaps and silences that exist in official archives, Black Archive Sweden do not approach the archive to repair and add to official archives' framework of history. Rather, we aim to highlight the archive as unstable, muddled, temporary, with space to contain possibilities for other imaginations, realities, experimentations, and conditions for the past, present, and future. We approach the archive as holding space for affect, poetics, relationality, unintelligibility, and the mundane. We aim to collect materials such as oral histories, photography, video and sound collection, publications, ephemera to construct a new community archive. We also aim to function as a place for meeting, constructive and healing dialogues, different forms of learning and unlearning, where Afro-Swede and Black people's experiences and realities are always the starting point. And so far, this has been materialized in talks, performances, exhibitions, workshops, publication, and an ongoing digital project on family archives. For example, in our exhibition, The Weight of Silence, the artist Ina Nyan investigated Sweden's investment in transatlantic slavery through its iron ore production. The artist particularly focused on the process of being in the archive and the difficulties physically and emotionally of finding and tracing history in official archives in Sweden. A process the artist described, was the metaphor of finding a needle in a haystack. Another event we had last year was a performance lecture by the scholars Lena Soya and Nana Osei Kofi titled Public Archives and Colonial Violence. And the starting point of the lecture is the statue translated to English as the 5 continents in a well-frequented square in Gothenburg, Sweden. The statue depicts 5 women representing the 5 world continents and was sculpted to praise and hail Gothenburg as a global exporter of iron ore. Lena Soya and Nana Osei Kofi pay particular attention to the bronze cast of naked women representing the continent of Africa. Through performance and with a methodology of listening, they attend to the low frequencies of the statue and what the statues sound about Sweden's imperial and colonial history. The public events have in different ways addressed the questions of what it means to refuse traditional forms of archiving and to center the experimental, the ordinary, the mess, by placing archive in dialogue with various artistic forms of expression and expressions. And as we move on with our work this year, we aim to focus primarily on researching and developing methods for creating our archival collections and the form of the archive by visiting and learning from existing community archives dedicated to Black life and history. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janelle. I think, thank you all so much for sharing your work. I'm just wanted to check a little bit. We're running a little bit over time, but I do think there's some questions we could cover. And then Mae-ling, do you think we can migrate some of the questions, some of the conversation to after the coffee break to a more general conversation? Or should we go a little bit over time? I just want to check that before we start.
Yeah, perhaps we can shorten our coffee break to 10 minutes instead of 15 and then come back for the discussion. Thanks.
That's perfect. Okay, so I'll dive in. I think there's so many things that we could touch on. And together with you, I would like to discuss narrative mode silences and what an archive can be. And I would like to start with you, Lavon. As an artist who calls the Virgin Islands your home, your work often seeks to subvert hierarchies and you use colonial artifacts to create a narrative that questions power and power relations. And it's important for you work to speak in layers. And Could you speak more about using colonial artifacts to question power and what speaking in layers means for you in your work, and if this had any specific meanings in your work that relates to the relationship between the Nordics and the Caribbean?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I guess it's a complex question with many parts. So maybe I'll start off with just in terms of my practice and the way that I think about building metaphors. You know, I went to art school in Cuba. So when you go to art school in a place that doesn't have freedom of speech, you begin to have to learn how to say something without saying it, or say it in multiple ways. And I think that kind of hiding, we can imagine also that is a part of our Black Atlantic traditions and forms of marronage, the kind of mocking and things like that that you see in Carnival, et cetera. It's kind of embedded in our responses to power, this way of speaking in multiple layers and to maybe also multiple audiences in our work. So I think that that strategy of making as an artist comes out of both my training and both my lived experience being a person, a Black person in the Caribbean. And I think with that said, you know, we are often inundated with, I mean, what does it feel like to live in a place where your towns are named after Danish kings? You know, our geography is very much built on this colonial legacies. And so I think we also live in a tremendous amount of symbolic violence. And so a lot of my work is responding to that in some ways and trying to reframe those narratives. You know, everything from, again, the coral stones and thinking about these, you know, they look like just tumbled rocks, but they actually, for me, I can see them as really repositories of our history and really objects that we can honor and hold up as a tribute, not just to the people's labor, but who they were, as people, and also, you know, also thinking through their own subjectivities that are on their hands. Because I think, you know, especially when we're thinking about architecture, you know, even today on Facebook, we had a big debate. We have a senator who's about to put forth a law to take down a lot of the historic structures that are in ruin, like my building was. But those are the structures that usually belong to Black people. They're the smaller working class structures. And people often don't see value in them for many different reasons. And so my, one is that there's this idea that they're colonial. they label everything as like with this colonial label, and that means that everything colonial means we need to, and they don't begin to pick apart. Yes, it comes from the colonial era, but their subjectivity are in these buildings. These buildings have so much connection to African architecture. There's so many other ways to see these fragments and to see these structures. And I think a lot of my work is directed to that and thinking about also another kind of archive. You know, not so much always worshiping the European document and objects, but recognizing that we can create our own archives, that we already are our own archives, that we can, and that we can use that to, you know, I think so much of it is really about owning our own stories and creating spaces for self-possession, especially as a Virgin Islander. We still are, we're not in a post-colonial phase. We're still in a very colonial phase. So all of that becomes, it's very critical and crucial of how we can need to move in the world. It's responding to an internal desire and also a collective need.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Lavon. And I would like to turn to you, Michael, next. You are the curator of the National Museum of World Culture in Stockholm, and you're responsible for the collection of the African continent. But you're also working on a more personal project where you seek to understand your own African diasporic family across the Atlantic world. And it's through a collection of photographs passed on by your father. And I also think about the two narratives that you presented today. we only know about them and their life worlds through the portrait and some of the things that you have come across in archives. And I'm thinking about this link about personal narratives and larger, grander narratives. And I'm also thinking about your relationship to working with artists, and also maybe share some reflection of the works such of the Queen Mary Monument, but other artistic works that you also work in your collections. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, working with artists and with the collections that I'm in charge of, or that is my job to take care of, has become kind of an oasis for me. So personally, it's been really important for my own sanity, working with these often very violent collections that I'm in charge of. But I mean, of course, the more important thing is what they do with the conversation and with the understanding of the African diaspora worldwide. So looking, for instance, at the Queen Mary project, which I have followed for quite some time. I think it's an amazing project, the way that it works with relationships between Denmark and the Caribbean, and it works with imagination, trying to understand, the different layers of people and places, and also that it's so politically aware. But I think one of the even more important, I think, is the kind of impetus and stimulus that these larger, let me call it a poster project, because I think it's a very important project in the whole of Northern Europe right now. I mean, it gives a very interesting or important stimulus to the other myriad smaller grassroots projects that are going on. And I think also the work that Janelle is doing with Black Archive Sweden is one example of so many different small projects that are going on in Denmark, Finland, Norway, the Netherlands. Communities are kind of working away with small and large projects, trying to, to connect the diaspora in different ways, digging in the archives, filling in the blanks, elaborating, fabulating Black history, and so on. I think that's to me, it's super important. I can also mention projects like the National Black Theatre in Sweden, which have also done very interesting things in terms of elaborating on these fragments that we have, because they're, like we said, these are fragments of archives that we can find. And we compare that to what Levon was saying, this profusion of proof that is found in the Caribbean of this colonial past. In Sweden, there's so few things, scarce things. So these are even more important. So for instance, the National Black Theatre, they worked with developing or fabulating around Evelina Crosby's life in a piece that is called Black Memory, which is really beautiful. But in terms of colonial artifacts, and I just have to, agree with what Levon was saying before about wresting some of these objects away from these grand narratives that they are caught in. And I think that's something that I have to do in the museum as well, because these objects they're caught in these very European narratives around what they are and what they mean, and they're taken away from all the immaterial practices of the African diaspora, the rituals, the songs, the stories, the dances, and we need to reconnect them to those, of course. And that's also something I like with this project that we're in today. It's beautiful in that way. Yeah.
No, thank you so much for that, Michael. I think it's definitely something very interesting with both the language that you talked about, Levon, the camouflage it and the fragmentation that you're speaking of. And Janelle, I would like to turn to you. And as of the founder and artistic director of Black Archive Sweden, I would like you to ask a similar question, like the links of the past and the present, and also speak more to the role of the role of archives to hold space for African experience and narratives but also holding space for other imaginaries and holding space for meeting and healing. Could you speak more to that?
Absolutely. In terms of holding space and thinking about creating conditions for healing, I think that is a crucial duty of the archives in general, because, and I think Lavon and Michael was mentioning, the archive have this historical relationship to violence and the effects of this violence, the pain, the disconnect, the open wounds that we still live in are things that cannot be ignored. So it makes sense that the archivist needs to be connected with reparative work that many archivists that are dedicated to attending to this history have been doing and is doing, and need to attend to the communities implicated by the collections that the archives hold. But for us at Black Archives specifically, creating space means facilitating both physical and digital space where we as Black people can meet on our own terms. We can meet to learn, to unlearn, for play, for laughter, for resting, for being in agreement, disagreement with each other, to create, to do nothing. The most important thing with our meeting is that it's on our own term and that we dictate it, and whiteness is not being centered and it's not guiding how we create our narratives and make sense to our experience, give meaning to our experiences.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think that this is where we have to wrap up this part of the conversation, but I hope to continue it with you off screen further on, but also after the coffee break in the more open general conversation. So thank you so much for your rich contribution today. And we might be moving over to the coffee break, Mae-ling.
Sorry, I just realized I was mute. Thank you very much to the last session panelists for such a moving, I mean, I want to move to Denmark or Stockholm, either I'll take, and participate in all of these activities and cultural events that you've got going on. There's so much more that I think we want to discuss, but we will enable that through after the coffee break. Everyone's going to come back as a panelist. So feel free to take a quick break. You can stay on this, and Izzy will move all of us into one room where we can share our cameras. I know there are a couple of important people who have to leave. And so if you do want to leave a message or any information on the work that you're doing that we can connect on later, please drop it in the chat and we'll follow up. So we'll see you in 10 minutes, and then we'll wrap up for the day after the discussion. Thanks.
When the sun comes up and the first quail calls, follow the drinking goes. The old man is